Senator Graham.
Thank you. To my dear friend Sheldon, I appreciate your consistency. So what would account for the elephant herd is apparently marching in one way. H.R. 1, I believe, is supported by most every liberal group in the country. Most of my Democratic colleagues support H.R. 1. Why? What motivates you? Redistricting. Under your proposal, you would take redistricting away from state elected officials and give it to some independent commission. What's that got to do with voting? That's about trying to change the ability of red states to be able to draw new lines based on population shift. H.R. 1 has a 6-to-1 match for low dollar donations. What's that got to do with voting? Nothing. It's got to do with political power, trying to have the federal government subsidize campaigns favorable to you. And if 6-to-1 match had been in place in my recent election, South Carolina would have probably had over $1 billion spent. I think the people of South Carolina deserve better than that. I raised 110. My opponent raised 132. If you had a 6-to-1 match, it'd have been about $1 billion. I think that's cruel and probably violates the Geneva Convention. So H.R. 1 is not about righting wrongs. It's about power. It's about trying to grab power, and I can understand why people want to grab it. I don't understand why people on our side would willingly sit on the sidelines, and we're not. But we're here today to talk about the voting process. Mr. Gardner, you're sort of a legend in your part of the world. I think rightly so. It's my understanding that you oppose H.R. 1 in the Senate equivalent. Is that correct?
Yes.
In 30 seconds or less, why?
Well, first of all, we don't have any early voting in New Hampshire. And for all the studies that show that early voting actually helps turnout, I can show you plenty of academic studies that show the opposite. Just because you make voting easier does not raise the turnout automatically. And we have election day that is a day for everything in New Hampshire. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Our Constitution predated the federal Constitution, and it ends that day. It's our tradition because every polling place, the chief election officer has to, that evening of the election, read publicly the votes cast for every candidate on the ballot, and that is the end of it. And our early voting, that what is called early voting across the country, is just not allowed under our Constitution.
So you believe that it would be a power grab when it came to New Hampshire voting? Is that fair to say? By the federal government?
Yes. And the same thing with no-fault absentee.
Okay.
We didn't even know, it's the same thing.
Thank you very much. The Carter-Baker Commission looked at voter fraud in voting in 2008. They found that there's no evidence of extensive fraud in U.S. elections or multiple voting, but both occur, and it could affect the outcome of close elections and many other findings. The absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. That's what the Carter-Baker Commission said, not me. The Carter-Baker report said, recommend to reduce fraud, recommend prohibiting third-party organization candidates and political party activists from handling absentee ballots. I think that's related to ballot harvesting. So my question for Ms. Abrams, do you support voter identification laws?
Yes.
Okay. Do you support...
There are 35 states in the United States that have had voter identification laws.
Okay.
In fact, every state requires some form of identification.
Okay.
What I have objected to is restrictive voter identification laws that narrow the set of permissible materials that allow you to prove your identity.
The answer is yes as a concept. Do you support the idea that voting should be limited to American citizens?
Yes.
do you support that we should have, do you support ballot harvesting? Are you familiar with that term?
I'm familiar with the term of art that's been propagated to describe a variety of efforts. But for example, on Native American reservations where they are precluded from access due to underfunding to reach in a timely fashion locations for voting, I do believe that it's appropriate for tribal elders to collect the ballots and retrieve them and use a single source of delivery to provide those ballots and thus provide Native Americans with the opportunity to participate in elections.
Do you support it beyond Native American voting?
As I've said, I believe that it depends on the situation and that the term of art that is being used describes a variety of behaviors, and each of those behaviors should be examined for utility and for veracity. And to the extent that they help voters participate in elections in a lawful manner, they should be permitted.
Okay. Do you believe the Republican majority in Georgia, House, Senate, when they are making the changes to your state voting laws, do you think they're motivated by trying to suppress the African American vote?
I have seen it happen sometimes that they are. I've seen other bills that have been truly bipartisan in nature that have looked at and fully examined.
But you believe that's the motivation behind? Do you believe that's the motivation behind these laws?
I believe the motivation behind certain provisions in SB 202 are a direct result to the increased participation of communities of color in the 2020 and 2021 elections. I have participated for 11 years. As Speaker Pro Tem Jones pointed out, we served together, and almost every year there was a voting law. And when those voting laws were neutral, not only on their face,
well, I'm out of time. Do you think the Speaker of the House, Speaker Pro Tem, the lady, Jan Jones, is motivated by trying to limit the African American voters in Georgia? Do you think?
I believe there is racial animus that generated those bills. I would not assume that that racial animus is shared by every person, but if the result is that racial animus exists and it eliminates access to the right to vote, then regardless of a certain person's heart, if the effect is deleterious to the ability of people of color to participate in elections, then that is problematic and that is wrong and it should be rejected by all.